Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about the future of automobiles. They're an essential part of our society, but they also cause problems that have to be solved, like pollution and urban congestion, and the fact that tens of thousands of people a year are killed in automobile accidents. My guest is working on all of these problems. He is Stephen Zoepf, Executive Director of the Center for Automotive Research at Stanford, or CARS, which brings together representatives of industry, academia, and government to study how cars of the future can be more human-friendly. Stephen has worked as an engineer and product manager at BMW and Ford, and has served on the technical staff of the U.S. Department of Transportation. He's won numerous awards and honors, including the Barry McNutt Award from the Transportation Research Board, the Singapore Global Challenge, and MIT's Infinite Mile Award for outstanding service to the Institute. And Stephen, I'd like to welcome you to the program today.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks so much for having me.
So tell me, what does CARS, your organization, actually do? What kind of problems do you work on?
Well, I think my way of thinking about it is that we work on sustainable transportation and all the dimensions of what that means. So I would say that a truly sustainable transportation system has three components. It has to be economically sustainable, it has to be environmentally sustainable, and then it has to be equitable or socially sustainable. And so, generally speaking, all of the research that we perform at CARS has to do with one of those three themes.
Now, what are the major areas of unsustainability that we're experiencing today that have to be resolved?
Sure. Well, I think that you see lots of them around us every day. Certainly, the safety issue, which you could, if you wanted to, characterize as an economic issue, is a real problem. I think that the statistics show that our rate of fatalities, for instance, in the U.S. is getting higher. So certainly anything that has to do with improving the safety of our roads is something that we want to work on.
So does that involve driverless cars where the car runs itself automatically? Is that the key to safety?
Well, I think it's certainly one approach. And automated vehicles, as you know, run the spectrum from very simple driver assistance systems all the way up to vehicles where you never need to touch a steering wheel, or there may not even be a steering wheel. And of course, our goal would be that these are systems that are safer than the human drivers they would replace.
Now, how close are we to that so that driverless cars are ready for prime time, as it were?
Well, I think that there's still lots of work to be done. Today there are systems available that we would call level 2 automated vehicles, and those are systems where the vehicle can control itself to a certain extent, but the operator is responsible for retaining control, or let's say taking control at any moment. And those are available today from manufacturers like Tesla or Mercedes and many others.
So you can't just go to sleep or read the newspaper in the car?
Well, you certainly shouldn't. I think the challenge is trying to remind people that, in fact, they still do have a responsibility to supervise the vehicle. And when you're in a car that is capable of controlling itself to a certain extent, it can be tempting to look down and start sending text messages or reading the newspaper.
Do you think we're going to get off gasoline-powered cars altogether, or are we still going to be having gas-powered vehicles for the foreseeable future?
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned that because we've just this week, in fact, had a few announcements in the past month or so about that issue. So India, for example, announced recently that it intends to move strongly towards electric vehicles by the year 2030. And in fact, I believe just 2 days ago, the UK announced quickly that they were going to ban the sale of gasoline and diesel vehicles by 2040. Now they quickly followed that up with another announcement saying that hybrid vehicles would still be eligible. But even allowing that, there are some strong policy signals that say that we'll be moving away from gasoline vehicles in the next few decades.
As a policy matter, can the government just decree that, or does it have to take into account real-world consequences?
Well, it's a pretty multifaceted problem. So, a government can certainly go out and make a policy goal, but then if they actually want to achieve that, typically there are a lot of more short-term measures that they would have to enact. Things like taxing the energy sources, or putting specific production goals in place for manufacturers.
Now, I know that people are developing electric cars.
Yeah.
Is there just one or two styles of electricity, and what are the possibilities there? You have the big, heavy battery technology. Mm-hmm. There's also something called hydrogen cell technology. Still an electric car, but it doesn't derive its energy from batteries, it derives them from fuel cells.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, so the tractive force going to the wheels in both of those cases you mentioned is coming from an electric motor. But the question is, well, what's the source of energy that's been putting in the tank? And certainly in the case of fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells, that would involve adding hydrogen to the car and developing a refueling infrastructure around that. So today that refueling infrastructure doesn't exist in very many places. Now, on the other hand, battery electric vehicles are effectively, big model cars with a battery in place, and they can drive 100, 200, maybe even 300 miles on a recharge. And I think that for many manufacturers, that's really a strong part of their future product plans. So Tesla today, for example, sells only battery electric vehicles, but there are many other manufacturers that do offer them.
One of the drawbacks is that it does take a long time to recharge it. If you drive it the full distance and want to get a full charge, it could be maybe half an hour or more, whereas it takes 2 minutes to fill up with gas. Is there any solution in sight to that problem?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fundamental one. So my thesis advisor from MIT, Professor John Haywood, used to like to make the analogy that when you hold a refueling nozzle for your gasoline-powered vehicle, there's 10 megawatts of chemical energy that's flowing through your hand there. And so now electrical vehicles are more efficient, so the comparison would be if you want to refuel at the same rate, you'd be looking at something like 3 megawatts of electricity flowing through your hand. Now, that's a pretty tall order, and so today we're still probably about a factor of 10 short of that under the best case scenario.
I understand that's a lot of work is being done on batteries using nanotechnology, increasing energy density, more electricity per gram of weight. Is that small incremental changes, or are we looking at something potentially revolutionary which will make it directly competitive? Because things have to be convenient for people to buy them, right?
Well, that's absolutely right, and I think that there are at least 3 dimensions that people at Stanford and many other places are working on. I would say the first of those, as you mentioned, was the rate of recharging, and that's something that is continuing to improve and involves changes to both the infrastructure and the batteries themselves. The second, as you mentioned just now, would be the energy density of those packs. How much energy can you cram in per kilogram of weight? And that's a number that's also continually improving. But I think it's happening relatively slowly with small increments to the chemistry, to the manufacturing processes, to the ability to put down layers of materials at very precise levels. And I would say the last one, of course, is cost. So for a gasoline-powered vehicle, the fuel tank is a trivial contributor to the cost of the vehicle. But for an electric-powered vehicle, it's really a very large percentage of the cost of the vehicle. And so, today we're down to maybe $150, $200 per kilowatt hour of energy. And I think that if we want to really make electric vehicles an attractive proposition to consumers, we have to continue that.
Now, some people have proposed the idea of using solar power. In fact, we're sitting in front of a picture of a solar vehicle, has Stanford's name on it. I think we have a full-size picture of that. Can we bring that up so we can take a better look at it?
Sure.
Waiting to see it here. Is that like a prototype? Does that car really run? Were you involved in building it? What's the story behind that car?
So the Stanford Solar Car Project is a team of mostly undergraduate students at Stanford, and they share a building with my organization. And this is, in fact, one of their cars from a few years ago. And as you noticed, it does have photovoltaic cells all over the surface of the vehicle, and that's a part of a student contest, a student project that a lot of different universities participate in. And it's essentially a contest of speed. But I think that the reason that we do this project is not that we think that someday there are going to be cars driving around mostly powered by energy coming from photovoltaic cells. In fact, I was part of the solar car project at MIT when I was there as an undergrad. And I think what we see now is that we may have photovoltaic cells providing energy to the grid on one side, and then electric vehicles pulling that energy out of the grid on the other side. So in that case, why are we doing this project where we embed the cells into the vehicles? And I think the reason for it is that it's just it's a fundamental fundamentally challenging engineering problem. So on one hand, you want lots of surface area for the solar cells, but on the other hand, you need something that's relatively aerodynamic. On one hand, you want to make the vehicle as quickly as possible, but so you have time to test, but then you need time to develop an aerodynamic design and something lightweight and robust. So a lot of these objectives are really in conflict with each other.
Well, is solar power really feasible for the surface as far as the amount of energy it can generate compared to the amount of energy you need to run the car? Like even if you let it sit in the sun all day long and then just take it out for a half-hour spin.
Well, so that's one of the reasons that car is shaped like it is, and what you'll see is many of the university teams that develop solar cars have a strong focus on developing something that's very lightweight and very aerodynamic. So the energy needed to move the car is a fraction of that, of what you would see a car on the street. So it might be maybe 1,000, 1,200 watts of energy can move the car at a highway speed or close to it. And so, you know, really, I wouldn't expect that the amount of energy that you could put onto a commercially available car would be able to power it.
Now we're talking about policy here. Do you think, as a matter of policy, the government should favor one technology over another and like push one or offer rebates for one, or just let the marketplace handle the whole thing?
Well, you know, there are different schools of thought on that. I think that most economists would probably tell you that a tax is the right answer for everything. And so many economists will say, well, the simple answer is tax fuel. And if fuel is producing the externality that you're concerned about, such as pollution or CO2 or consumption of energy produced non-domestically, whatever the particular issue is, then you should tax that fuel. If parking is the concern, and congestion is the concern, then maybe you ought to be taxing the use of the infrastructure. But the point of fact is it's very hard to actually institute those policies and do so in a sort of an acceptable way. And so the policies that we have tend to be more favored towards setting a level of required efficiency or pushing specific technologies.
It looks like you work with a lot of sponsors or affiliates. Your website lists affiliates like Ford, General Motors, Toyota, Hyundai.
That's right.
Transportation Department, various agencies. What do all these organizations contribute to the work?
Well, I think it really varies from sponsor to sponsor. And of course, as you mentioned, we are privileged to have a lot of support from many different players in the industry. I think that one of the reasons that they come to Stanford is because it is an area, sort of a safe space for collaboration. You can do work that really is objective and academically rigorous, but it's not sort of in service of any one company or organization.
Now, one of the big complaints about cars today is traffic. If you live in a dense urban area, LA, New York, or even here in the Bay Area, people spend enormous amounts of hours on the road cursing and fuming. Why don't these people get moving? It's frustrating, it's expensive, it's time wasting.
It is.
Do you address that problem at all?
We do, and I think that one of our researchers likes to frame the problem of, let's say, of automated vehicles and the motivation for them really being an economic problem. And he adds up the time that's lost in waiting in traffic, the economic losses in the fatalities and injuries that we see on the road, as well as the excess consumption during congestion. And the number that he comes up with is something like $1.5 trillion annually that we lose in these various system inefficiencies that we have on the road today. So certainly all of those problems are ones that we would all like to see addressed.
Yeah. Now, what can we do about that? Like, one problem is that usually you have a car that holds 5 or 6 people, and most of the time you're in it by yourself, so you're wasting all the space, taking up all the space on the roadway. Is there any possible solution to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you've really hit the nail on the head. And average occupancy in the U.S. is something like 1.4 people per car. So most of the time, it's one of us in the car by ourselves. And so and that really is a problem. And I think that our mentality in the past few decades, maybe the past century, has been it's been a Swiss Army knife model. So effectively what we're doing is we're buying one tool or one car that can serve virtually all of our needs. So it can fit our entire family, probably most of our luggage, and it can go 500 miles pretty easily. But in point of fact, we rarely use all those capabilities. And so what I would like to see, and I think we are starting to see, is a migration towards what I would call more of a toolbox model, where you take the right tool for the trip that you have in mind. So if you're going to a business commute, you can take a small vehicle, probably pretty efficient, or take a larger vehicle, but in conjunction with a number of other passengers. And it's only when you really do have that long-range need or that high-capacity need that you rent or you borrow that vehicle that's appropriate for that trip.
So I think we're talking about a model where maybe you don't own your own car, but you summon a car of the appropriate type when you need it?
Certainly that would be one of the ways you could see that, and there are lots of different ways that we're seeing this, the shared mobility model manifest itself. In some cases it's a car-sharing model, like a Zipcar style model, or in other cases it's an Uber style model where somebody else is doing the driving, or a pooled model, like an Uber pool or a Lyft line, where you're getting put into a car with a bunch of other people along the same route. Now, I think the trick is trying to get the occupancy rates up, as you said, or trying to get the size of the vehicle down.
Now, America has long had kind of a love affair with cars. People love their cars. They love to polish them and care about how they look. And they don't want to drive some stranger's car. They want to go out in their car, which they bought to express their personality. Would people have a sense of loss if they have a model where, well, you rent a car when you need to go somewhere?
Well, that's certainly a really interesting question, and I'm a car guy since way back. I graduated from school and went into the car industry, and I spent most of my career there. And I think that there certainly is some sort of personal association with a car. And when you buy a car, it certainly is an extension of your personality. I think most people would agree that the brand of car that you buy, the color, maybe even the body style of the car expresses something about you. And so the question is, when you rent a car for maybe a couple of hours, or maybe you're even only in a car, a borrowed car for a few minutes, is that still an extension of your personality? And I think most people would probably say no. And I think that the interesting thing there is that effectively what that means is that the attributes of the service are becoming more important to a certain extent than the attributes of the thing itself.
Because people want to go when they want to go. If you want to go somewhere on the spur of the moment, you don't want to have to necessarily make a phone call or use an app and wait for a car to come to you.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think if I were to offer you the alternative of hailing a ride in your favorite shared mobility system, and I offer you two alternatives. One is I'm going to offer you a high-end luxury car that'll be there in 45 minutes, or a relatively cheap car that'll be there in 5 minutes. Which would you pick?
Well, depending on who I'm trying to impress, if anybody, I'd go for the speed.
Yeah, exactly, and I think most people would agree with you. And so I think you've hit on a couple of important points. One is it really depends on what you're using the service for, and that may make a difference in what you look for. And my research has shown that. But I think the other thing is most of the time it's the service attributes that tend to be more important.
Well, even if you're just driving by yourself and need a small car, it's probably going to have several seats, but the extra seats I don't think add that much to the weight of the car. Most of the weight is in the engine. So whether it's a two-seater or a four-seater...
Yeah, I think within the constraints of the current, let's say, the light-duty passenger car model, I think there's a limited amount that you can do and still meet the requirements of that kind of classification. I think if you really wanted to get down to a meaningful change in the usage of the roads, you would have to get to a much smaller vehicle and potentially allocate some infrastructure to it.
Do you think that some kind of public transportation might be useful for some of our needs, like Elon Musk's Hyperloop, for example?
Yeah, so I think that we're sort of in a world where the bridge between public and private transportation is becoming, let's say the line between them is becoming blurrier and blurrier, because you have in some cities allocation of service like paratransit services is being given to some of the shared mobility services. In other cases you have the shared mobility services offering vehicles that are effectively public buses running fixed routes. So that line is becoming hard to discern.
What about carpooling? There's a push to have these HOV lanes, high occupancy vehicles, 2 people or more. Do you think that really helps? Because is that going to make people carpool who wouldn't otherwise? Because to carpool, you need to find someone who's going where you're going, when you're going, and maybe coming back at the same time you're coming back.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I don't have a definitive answer for you. I can tell you that for many people, the reason that they buy a plug-in vehicle is to get access to that carpool lane sticker. It's not necessarily because they like the vehicle. So for at least some people that are eligible for that lane, it's been a meaningful, let's say, thumb on the scale in favor of a high-tech vehicle at least.
Do you think maybe we live in a society where we do too much driving? Maybe we should stay home more. Maybe we could work from home sometimes. Or do you think people are always going to have to leave their home and go 10 or 20 miles or more to get to their work, like every day?
You know, that's a really interesting point. I think fundamentally what you're asking is communication a complement or a substitute for transportation? So, for instance, as we get more and more engaged in the virtual world, be it through something like a Facebook or LinkedIn, or if we get more connected to our office through WebEx tools, does that mean that we need to travel less? And I think that there are conflicting opinions on that. There's a researcher out of Harvard University, Ed Glazer, that's written a book called The Triumph of the City, that he starts to get at that issue. And I think the side that he came down, if I remember correctly, was that it seems to be that those two things are in fact complements, that as you get more connected with your social network, you want to become more connected physically as well.
Now, does your organization do real technical research, or is it more of a think tank kind of thing where you bring together people in different disciplines and try to define what the problems are and come up with potential solutions?
Well, we certainly do some of both. We have funds from our sponsors, and we are able to support lots of different areas of research around Stanford that we feel are particularly important to the future of transportation. And in some cases, that means fundamental technical research, as you mentioned, such as we have one researcher that's looking at the security of GPS signals and how we adapt GPS for a future where it might be increasingly attractive to hack those sensors.
I mean, somebody could hack you and take your car someplace other than where you want it to go?
Absolutely, and then there have been a number of proof of concepts out there that have shown, in fact, that it's possible to make a hostile takeover of a drone or of a boat simply by controlling the GPS that's going to the vehicle in question. So I think that is a very real concern, and only one of many pathways that we might be worried about in the future.
Now, I've heard proposals for having big cargo trucks operate essentially as drones, no driver needed. Mm-hmm. But if somebody wanted to sabotage that, it would be pretty easy. All you would have to do is stand in front of one because it's probably programmed not to hit people.
Well, I think there certainly are lots of social questions around that, and I think that the cargo area is particularly attractive because there's always a strong push to operate the cargo system more efficiently, and every dollar, every penny matters, especially in that environment. And as you mentioned, most of those over-the-road trucks are on the highway going a steady speed, and it's a more controlled environment. But if things do go wrong, then you've obviously got a multi-ton vehicle with a lot of energy behind it. So I think there's some trade-offs both ways.
Now, if we have smart cars that have better reflexes than humans and see better than humans, would we want to raise the speed limit instead of 70, make it 100, because these cars could probably manage that without much risk?
Well, I think that's also an interesting question. I think that there are lots of trade-offs there and involved in raising the speed limit. I think that if we look at the future trade-offs, fundamentally one of them that Chris Gerdes at Stanford likes to talk about is the trade-off between safety, mobility, and legality. And I think the trade-off that you're talking about is a trade-off between mobility and safety. So the faster you go, the more, let's say, the greater the magnitude of the consequences when things do go wrong. And I think in the near term, we're going to be talking mostly about mixed traffic, where you've got a combination of semi-autonomous, maybe fully autonomous, and human-piloted vehicles. And I think in that kind of a mixed environment, there's going to be a real limit on how high you can go with the speed limit. Now, if you think a few years farther into the future, where maybe we do have infrastructure or geographic areas that are allocated to autonomous vehicles only, then you could raise the speed limit potentially and not have much of a trade-off in safety. I think the concern there is that you've definitely got an exponential growth in energy consumption there. So it depends on what our goal is. Is our goal mobility at all costs? Is our goal to try to force some of that benefit to go into the environmental space as well?
Speaking of expenses, what about the possibility of flying cars? Takes a lot more energy to stay in the air than just to roll on level terrain, but three-dimensional flying would certainly ease gridlock a lot. Are we getting close to that? And we have drone aircraft now, self-piloting.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of questions. One is, well, are we developing some sort of new device like a quad rotor but with a cockpit in it, or are we using something more conventional like a helicopter? I think you already are seeing mobility as a service using helicopters in some countries in the world, and I think particularly it's been where the traffic is so dense that the difference between ground transportation and air transportation is enormous. I think it's also typically happening in places where safety is an issue, so wealthy passengers might have real concerns about traveling on the ground. I think in the slightly longer term, the question is whether we could build that as sort of a mass market transportation device, and I think that there are pretty serious questions around noise pollution, around vulnerability of people under the ground, fail-safe modes for those devices. I think those are a little bit farther off than fully autonomous ground vehicles.
We just have about a minute left, but quickly, sure. From your vantage point, what do you think is the most likely change we're likely to see in the way we drive in the next 5 years or so?
Well, I think that, it's I guess a question of what I expect to see versus what we'd really like to see. I think that what I would really like to see is progression towards autonomy in largely a shared mobility scenario, and I would like to see it in conjunction with urban policy that makes sure that the benefits are not just towards mobility.
Okay, and I'd like to thank you very much because we are out of time. I've been speaking with Stephen Zoepf, Executive Director of the Center for Automotive Research at Stanford. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks a lot, Marty.
Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Marty Wasserman, and we'll see you next time.